The Inca built stone walls so precise that a razor blade cannot fit between the joints, and after 5 centuries of trying, no one has fully explained how. At Sacsayhuaman, stones weighing up to 200 tons interlock in complex polygonal patterns without mortar, surviving devastating earthquakes that have repeatedly collapsed the Spanish colonial buildings stacked on top of them. Jean-Pierre Pratzen, the University of California, Berkeley architect who has done more than anyone to crack this mystery, demonstrated that simple hammerstones can shape and fit small blocks. Yet even he admitted he could not explain how stones weighing 100 tons were repeatedly lifted and lowered during the fitting process. The gap between what experimental archaeology has replicated and what actually exists in Cusco remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing open questions. The precision of Inca stonework operates on 2 levels, one verified, one still debated. Pratzen documented joints fitted within fractions of a millimeter, a finding echoed by the 16th century conquistador Pedro Pizarro, who wrote that the stones were so close together and so well fitted that the point of a pin could not have been inserted in one of the joints. A 2022 archaeoseismological study classified any gap exceeding 0.3 centimeters in fine Inca masonry as anomalous, meaning the standard tolerance sits well under 3 millimeters. But here is the critical nuance most popular accounts omit. The tight fit typically extends only a few centimeters deep on lateral joints. Internally, stones are often slightly wedge-shaped, with gaps packed with a sticky red clay the Inca called langkak alpa and rubble fill. However, on the most elite structures, the Sacred Plaza at Machu Picchu, and certain walls at Coricancha, the precision extends through the entire thickness. What makes the precision genuinely puzzling is the 3-dimensional nature of the fit. Joint surfaces are not flat, they are warped, curved, concave, and convex surfaces that bear no simple geometric relationship to each other, yet still match precisely. As one researcher noted, the template needs to change shape constantly as the cutters move down the sides of the stone. This 3-dimensional matching problem remains the single most difficult aspect to explain. The most dramatic evidence sits on the northern outskirts of Cusco at an elevation of 3,701 meters. Sacsayhuaman's 3 zigzag terrace walls extend over 400 meters, reaching heights of roughly 6 meters, built from stones that range from hand-sized to enormous blocks estimated at 128 to 200 tons. The material is primarily diorite porphyry, with Mohs hardness 6 to 7, with limestone foundations transported from 15 kilometers away, and dark andesite from the Rumicota quarry 35 kilometers southeast. Only about 40% of the original structure survives. The Spanish systematically dismantled Sacsayhuaman for building material after suppressing Manco Inca's rebellion in 1536. Garcilaso de la Vega lamented that there was not a house in the city that had not been made of this stone. What remains are the massive blocks too heavy to move, which paradoxically means we see only the most extreme examples of Inca engineering. Downtown, the 12-angled stone sits embedded in the wall of the former palace of Inca Roca, approximately 1 meter high by 1.2 meters wide, carved from green diorite and weighing roughly 6 tons. Its 12 visible angles fit seamlessly against every neighboring stone. Yet it is not even the most complex example. Stones with 20 and 32 angles exist at Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, where the finest ashlar masonry in the empire once gleamed beneath 700 sheets of gold. Jean-Pierre Pratzen's experimental archaeology remains the most rigorous scientific attempt to solve the construction mystery. His method was elegant. Use only the tools found abundantly at Inca sites, river cobble hammerstones of quartzite or hematite weighing up to 10 kilograms, and try to replicate the work. Striking andesite at an angle of 15 to 25 degrees while rotating the hammerstone at impact, he could shape blocks efficiently, using red clay or stone dust as an impression medium between stones to identify high spots. He demonstrated that trial and error fitting could produce joints within fractions of a millimeter for manageable size blocks. But Pratzen was scrupulously honest about the gaps. He could not explain how the largest stones, 100 tons or more, were repeatedly lifted and lowered during the fitting process, which his method requires. He calculated that dragging a 140-ton block up the Ollantaytambo ramp would require approximately 2,400 workers, yet the ramps are only 6 to 8 meters wide. He wrote that getting the men was no problem, but where did they all stand? And he did not attempt to replicate the most complex three-dimensional fitting of massive polygonal blocks. In 2017, European chemist Helmut Trebuch published a paper proposing an explanation that bridges the gap between folklore and Pratzen's experimental work. Spanish chroniclers described a reddish mud and molten gold used between stones. Trebuch identified the gold as likely pyrite, and the Quechua name Yancac Alpa conveyed stickiness and unpleasantness to the touch. His theory is that Inca miners routinely encountered acid mine drainage from pyrite oxidation, producing sulfuric acid reaching pH 0.5, 10,000 times more acidic than humic acid. This extremely acidic mud could superficially dissolve silica containing volcanic rocks into a silica gel, creating glassy, smooth surfaces. When stones were pressed together with this mud between them, the weight of the blocks contributed to dissolving high contact points through pressure dissolution, a known geological process. Trebuch's theory does not claim stones were molded like clay. Blocks were still quarried and shaped with tools. The acid mud would have been used to perfect the final joint surfaces, achieving the last fraction of a millimeter. However, no experimental verification has yet been published. The stone softening folklore itself has a long pedigree. Hiram Bingham wrote that Peruvians told stories of a plant whose juices rendered the surface of a block so soft that the fitting was accomplished by rubbing the stones together. Father Jorge A. Lira, a Catholic priest, claimed in a 1983 television interview to have rediscovered the method, but was reportedly unable to make the stones hard again. He died in 1988 and took to his grave the secret. The most dramatic proof of Inca engineering superiority replays itself with almost theatrical regularity. On March 31st, 1650, a massive earthquake struck Cusco and destroyed nearly every Spanish colonial building, while Inca walls and foundations beneath them stood firm. The curved Inca wall of Cortacancha remained unscathed as the Church of Santo Domingo built upon it crumbled. Exactly 3 centuries later, on May 21st, 1950, a magnitude 6+ earthquake destroyed 90% of Cusco's buildings. The Church of Santo Domingo collapsed again, while the Inca wall still stood. The engineering principles at work are now partially understood. Dry fit joints allow controlled movement. Without mortar, stones can shift during seismic events and resettle afterward, a phenomenon known as the dancing stones. Walls lean inward by 3 to 5 degrees, lowering the center of gravity. Polygonal masonry creates multiple contact points that spread stress forces across broader areas than rectangular blocks. Whether the Inca designed for earthquake resistance intentionally remains debated, but a 2022 survey identified evidence of an earthquake around 1450 CE that appears to have catalyzed a shift from earlier architecture using smaller stones to the massive construction style we see today. Construction began under Pachacuti, Inca Yupanqui, who reigned from 1438 to 1471 and reconceived Cusco as an imperial capital shaped like a puma. Cieza de Leon documented a workforce of 20,000 men at Sacsayhuaman. 4,000 of them quarried and cut the stones, 6,000 hauled them with great cables, and the others dug the ditch and laid the foundations. Construction spanned roughly 100 years before the Spanish arrival. The Inca, however, built upon earlier foundations. The Quilca culture constructed the first structures at Sacsayhuaman around 1100 CE. Some scholars argue that Inca stonemasonry was inspired by Tiwanaku architecture from Bolivia, which collapsed around 1000 CE. The problem is how expertise survived the 300-year gap, a transmission mystery within the larger construction mystery. The honest answer to how Cusco's megalithic walls were built is, we know the rough outlines, but not the details that matter most. No comprehensive three-dimensional scanning study measuring joint tolerances has been published. No physical shake table tests on replica Inca walls have been conducted. The exact fitting procedure for curved surface megalithic joints remains unproven at scale. No published microscopic analysis of stone surfaces exists that might confirm the acid mud theory. The internal structure of the walls remains largely unknown. The most fundamental obstacle is irreversible. The Inca had no alphabetic writing system. Their construction knowledge was held by master masons in a civilization that organized knowledge through practice, memory, and oral transmission. When the Spanish conquest shattered Inca society and dismantled their greatest structures, that knowledge died with its keepers. We are left with the stones themselves, mute perfect, fitted together with the precision that implies a depth of understanding we have not yet recovered. The walls do not explain themselves. They simply endure, outlasting every building placed upon them, answering earthquakes with a gentle dance and then settling back into silence.